Ma'am, there must be a mistake. Your name. It's not on the list. 12 words. That's all it took to remind her she was never really seen. But Celeste Monroe didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't flinch, because she'd been here before, in lobbies where no one looked up, in rooms where she was the architect, but never the assumption. So she stood still, alone, while inside the cameras flashed, the champagne flowed, and the man who had come with her had no idea she was missing. What they didn't know, what no one yet understood, was that the woman they'd turned away was the reason any of them were here. And by the time they looked up again, they'd be too late to pretend they hadn't seen her. Stay with us, because what begins as an erasure ends in a reckoning. Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been overlooked and stayed silent, just long enough to be heard? The Palais Garnier shimmered under the Parisian night like a dream carved in gold. Outside, a velvet carpet rolled across the marble steps, lined with soft-glow lanterns and camera flashes that burst like summer lightning. Laughter bubbled from the arriving elite, celebrities, heirs, diplomats, all dressed in designer silks and tuxedos with pocket squares so sharp they could slice glass. This wasn't just a charity gala. It was the event of the season, and tonight, image was everything. Celeste Monroe stood tall near the check-in stand, her mocha skin glowing under the soft lights, her tailored Elie gown trailing like liquid bronze behind her. Her hair was pinned in a classic French twist, her only jewelry a pair of diamond studs and a simple gold bracelet. She didn't need to flaunt wealth. Her presence whispered it in a language too subtle for the untrained ear. She gave her name clearly, her tone warm but poised. Celeste Monroe. +1. The young woman behind the tablet barely looked up. I'm sorry, there's no Monroe listed. Celeste smiled, assuming it was a small error. It may be under Julian Monroe. My husband still no glance, just a few swift taps on the screen, the clack of long acrylics. No Monroe, ma'am. Behind her, someone in a white tux groaned impatiently. A woman in red Dior heels clipped past, brushing Celeste's shoulder with the intentional disregard of someone used to space being made for her. Celeste stepped aside calmly, her fingers curling ever so slightly into her clutch. She tried again, gently. Could you double-check, please? This gala is partially funded by our foundation. Now the woman looked up, but only for a second. A glance, cold, measured, dismissive. Ma'am, you're holding the line. If you don't have credentials, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Celeste blinked. Her body stayed still, but inside something tensed. She didn't yell, she didn't argue. That wasn't her style. Her grace had been carved over years of being mistaken for someone's assistant, someone's +1, someone's help. She was used to walking into rooms where her skin color rewrote her resume before she ever spoke. But tonight, this question mark. This was different. She stepped aside. The world spun on without her. Cameras flashed for a soap actress behind her. Champagne was handed to influencers before they even stepped through the archway. She was still. A figure cloaked in elegance, now shivering slightly from the wind that snaked through the open plaza. A staff member approached her quietly, trying to usher her toward a side lobby, an alternate entrance, a quieter one, a back door. She declined. She didn't need an alternate entrance. She didn't need special treatment. She needed what everyone else here had been granted without question, basic dignity. But she didn't argue, not yet, because while they hadn't seen her tonight, while her name had been forgotten, overlooked, or erased, she knew something they didn't. This story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Celeste stood on the edge of the velvet carpet, her heels planted like roots, her poise untouched, even as something sharp and slow burned beneath her collarbone. Not rage, not even embarrassment, something deeper. The heavy, aching weight of familiarity. She'd known this moment before. Not here, not in this dress, but in conference rooms where her ideas had been credited to the man seated next to her. in lobbies where security assumed she was lost, in fundraisers where donors handed their checks to the nearest white man, even when her name was on the letterhead. And now here again, standing outside the very event she had helped bring to life. She knew her name was on the guest list. She had reviewed it herself. Julian's assistant had double-checked every detail the week before. The Monroe Foundation had donated 2.5 million euros to tonight's cause, enough to have their names engraved on the back of the programs, enough for a personal note from the organizers begging them to attend. And yet, when she gave her name at the door, all they saw was a well-dressed black woman with no obvious entourage, no red-bottomed shoes, no flash of paparazzi behind her. Too elegant to be ignored, but too unfamiliar to be important. The irony. She had chosen this dress for its restraint. No thigh-high slit, no plunging neckline, no glittering neckline to announce her worth. Just silk, bronze silk that matched the undertone of her skin like it had been poured on purpose. Celeste had always believed in the power of understatement, of letting presence speak louder than volume, but maybe presence only spoke to those who listened. The young woman with the tablet hadn't listened, nor had the security detail who hovered just close enough to make a point. They saw no security badge, no publicist, no desperate need to be let in. And because she hadn't begged, they mistook her quiet for absence, her stillness for powerlessness. They didn't recognize her because she hadn't asked to be recognized. And yet, Celeste Monroe was no socialite passing through a borrowed spotlight. She was the architect behind entire initiatives in the Global South, the co-founder of 3 youth equity programs, and the chair of the very fund this gala celebrated. She had spent months on calls with ambassadors and artists and advisors, curating tonight's list, pairing donors with beneficiaries. She had personally selected the headliner, an orchestral quartet from Ghana performing their first European commission. She hadn't just been invited, she had built the room, and still, they had chosen not to see her. Not because she was invisible, but because they assumed someone like her couldn't hold that kind of power. Celeste exhaled slowly, the Paris night brushing over her cheekbones like an apology from a city that didn't know her heart. She didn't pull out her phone. She didn't call Julian. Not yet. She would let them sit with their assumptions just a little longer. Sometimes the silence before the storm was the loudest part, and they were about to hear her name. Julian Monroe didn't do red carpets. He wasn't the kind of billionaire who posed with champagne flutes or offered sound bites for the press. While others jockeyed for attention, he stayed in the background, running the show with quiet precision. Boardrooms listened when he spoke. Cities reshaped skylines when he invested. But at parties like this, he preferred to let others shine. He came late on purpose, usually slipping in through a side entrance, watching from a corner table, saying little and signing checks that moved mountains. Tonight was no different. A black car slid down the Rue Scribe, its windows dark and discreet. Inside, Julian checked his phone once, glanced at the time, and adjusted the cuff of his midnight suit. He looked like what the tabloids called quiet wealth. No logos, no fuss. Just presence, the kind you couldn't fake. As the car pulled up to the Palais Garnier, he noticed the crowd outside. Paparazzi, guests, the usual crush of flashbulbs and velvet ropes. But then his driver said something that made him look twice. "There's been a bit of confusion, sir. Your wife, Mrs. Monroe, she's still outside. They say she wasn't on the list." Julian blinked, then frowned. "What do you mean, not on the list?" The driver hesitated. Security wouldn't let her in. She didn't want to make a scene. She's just waiting. For a moment, Julian didn't move. The words hung in the air like smoke. Not on the list. His wife. The woman whose name was on every contract, whose efforts had built the very gala these people were now sipping cocktails inside of. Celeste. The most brilliant, grounded, quietly powerful woman he knew. The one who made him believe in this work in the first place. He stepped out of the car, not rushed, not flustered, just deliberate. The air around him seemed to fold as he entered it. His height, his posture, the weight of a man used to doors opening before he even knocked. But this time, the door had stayed shut, and it had shut on her. Julian didn't need to ask where she was. He saw her instantly, standing just beyond the edge of the carpet, back straight, hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't looking for anyone. She was simply waiting, stillness, wrapped in pride. He crossed the distance without a word, the crowd parting instinctively. No introductions, no greetings. Just Julian stepping next to her, placing one hand lightly on the small of her back. "I heard," he said quietly. "Let's fix it." Celeste didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply turned, her eyes meeting his with something unspoken. Thank you, maybe, or finally. And together they walked up the steps. Inside, the organizers barely had time to react. The head of the committee turned, all sycophantic charm, and froze mid-sentence when Julian held up a single hand. "She was here before me," he said, "and you told her she didn't belong." No one knew what to say, but everyone was about to learn exactly who they had dismissed. Inside the gala, the world glittered. Chandeliers dripped light like honey, the string quartet floated through a rendition of Debussy, and golden trays of oysters and champagne weaved their way between gowns and velvet tuxedos. Names floated in the air. Old money, new royalty, tech titans, political darlings, all tossed like party favors into the room's electric hum. It was a room built on prestige, where everyone wanted to be seen, where being seen was half the donation. Outside, Celeste Monroe stood alone, poised like sculpture. She had been waiting for nearly 20 minutes now, long enough to feel the changing tone in the air around her. People stopped glancing at her and simply started looking past her. The same woman who had once been interviewed by Le Monde for her leadership in post-colonial education reform now watched as interns and influencers strolled past her with air kisses and invitations. No one stopped to wonder who she was. No one asked if she needed help. They simply assumed she didn't belong. A security guard stepped closer. Not unkind, just procedural. He had the apologetic smile of someone trained to de-escalate. "Madame," he said, lowering his voice as if her presence were a disturbance, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable waiting in the side lobby. We have a lounge area, less foot traffic." Celeste met his eyes without flinching. "No, thank you. I'll stay here." He blinked, hesitated, then gave a polite nod and retreated, radioing something low and inaudible into his headset. Celeste exhaled slowly. The urge to walk away tugged at her like gravity. She could have called Julian, could have stepped into the car still idling nearby, and vanished from this circus of borrowed manners and fragile egos. But she didn't, because something deeper had rooted her to that spot. Something not just about tonight, but about every other time her name had been filtered through someone else's expectation of what power should look like. Inside, applause broke out. A former prime minister had just entered. People clinked their glasses together in rehearsed delight. A well-known actress posed for photos in front of a media wall that Celeste herself had commissioned months ago. She watched the rhythm of it all, the performance, the polish, the unspoken hierarchy, and felt like she was peering through a two-way mirror. She could see them, but they refused to see her. A man in a sharp silver suit laughed too loudly near the entrance, brushing past Celeste as if she were part of the architecture. His cologne lingered for a moment, then disappeared. She didn't move. She wasn't here for attention. She was here because she had earned it. And still, no one thought to ask why the woman in the bronze silk gown, the one standing just behind the velvet rope, her back straight, her expression unreadable, remained there, unmoving. They didn't recognize her. But they would. Soon. The doors opened without ceremony. No herald, no snapping cameras. Just a quiet ripple in the energy, the kind that moves through a room before the mind can catch up. Julian Monroe stepped into the ballroom like a question that couldn't be ignored. 6'3", broad-shouldered in a sharp black suit, no tie, collar open just enough to hint at irreverence. He carried no visible wealth, no visible guard, just presence. That rare, magnetic calm that silenced rooms before he ever said a word. At first, no one noticed. Then, everyone did. The host committee was mid-toast when a tremor of recognition sparked at the edges of the crowd. A woman in pearls lowered her glass. A hedge fund heir straightened his jacket. The mayor's advisor whispered something under his breath. Julian didn't scan the room. He didn't need to. His eyes were set, focused, purposeful. The head of the planning committee, Etienne Moreau, a slender man with a voice like butter and a Rolodex of every guest's net worth, rushed forward, smiling with the kind of urgency that blurred charm and fear. "Mr. Monroe," he gushed, "what an honor. We weren't sure if you'd make it tonight, but what a pleasure. Your support has meant the world." Julian nodded once, slowly, his expression unreadable. "Of course." Moreau launched into something rehearsed, a string of curated gratitude. "Your foundation's impact in Senegal, the youth center in Marseille. We're deeply grateful." Until Julian raised a hand. "Where's my wife?" The words were calm, measured, but they dropped into the conversation like a rock into glass. Silence cracked outward from the center. Etienne blinked. "Pardon?" "My wife, Celeste Monroe. She arrived before I did." Moreau's smile faltered. He turned slightly, scanning the room, then whispered something to an assistant, who immediately vanished through a side hallway. She must be," he started, but Julian was already walking past him. Guests parted. Conversations stuttered. Nobody dared interrupt. People watched now, heads swiveling, phones lowering, flutes of champagne trembling just slightly between fingers. Julian wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. His restraint was louder than outrage. His silence demanded answers. From across the room, a woman whispered, "That's her husband." Someone else murmured, "I didn't even know she was married." The assistant returned, eyes wide, whispering into Moreau's ear. Etienne paled. "She wasn't let in," he said carefully. "There was a mix-up at the entrance." Julian turned to him then, slowly. "A mix-up." Moreau tried to recover. "The list must have... She may not have checked in with the correct credential. It's possible the greeters..." Julian's voice cut through him. "She built this event. She spent 6 months shaping the guest list you're now blaming." No raised voice, no accusation, just precision. The ballroom air shifted, thick with shame, with recognition, with dread. "Fix it," Julian said. Moreau nodded frantically, beckoning to security, to staff, to anyone who could move faster than this unraveling silence. But it was too late, because power had walked into the room, and it wasn't smiling anymore. Julian stood at the foot of the host committee's table, the very one he and Celeste had helped fund, design, and place in the center of the ballroom. A long white cloth covered the surface, scattered with tablets, checklists, sleek name tags, and the polished chaos of last-minute logistics. But none of it mattered. Not the gilded menus, not the silent auction boards, not the vintage champagne chilling in sterling buckets. "I want to see the list," Julian said again, quieter this time, and that somehow made it more urgent. The event director, an older Frenchman named Leclerc, who'd orchestrated hundreds of galas in his career, stepped forward, all tight smiles and thinning patience. "Of course, Mr. Monroe, we're deeply sorry. There must have been an error. The lists were finalized just yesterday. I assure you, we had every intention." "Show me the paper copy," Julian interrupted, still calm. Leclerc blinked. "Well, the digital version, the paper, the one your security team uses." That was the first time Julian's tone shifted. Not loud, not angry, but firm, final, the kind of voice people only argued with once. An assistant scurried off, returning moments later with a white folder marked, "Check-in, final." Julian opened it himself, flipping pages with slow precision. A finger ran down the alphabetical list. Column after column of names: de Lavoisier, Chang, Devereaux, Lim, and then he saw it. Celeste Monroe. Her name. Scratched through with a ballpoint pen. Neatly, intentionally. The ink ran through her first and last name in a smooth, practiced motion. No smudge, no hesitation. Julian held up the page, his finger resting over the crossed-out text. He didn't look at Leclerc. He didn't need to. She was here, he said, before the lights, before the speeches, before the cameras. She stood outside this building while guests whose names meant nothing to this cause walked past her. Leclerc stepped forward, pale now. "Monsieur, please. This is clearly a clerical mistake. Perhaps the team was confused, or the name was duplicated elsewhere, or—" "No," Julian said simply. He turned the list around and held it out. "This isn't confusion. This is a decision. Someone made the choice to erase her, and you assumed she wouldn't matter." The room had quieted around them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silverware froze above plates. Even the musicians at the edge of the ballroom seemed to sense something shifting in the air and let the final note of their arrangement stretch a little longer, unresolved. Julian stepped aside and lifted his hand. Every head turned. Celeste stood at the entrance, backlit by the foyer's soft golden light. She hadn't moved forward. She hadn't pushed past security. She had simply waited, watching. Her gown shimmered with a quiet authority, her chin lifted just slightly. Not defiant, dignified. Julian looked back to the director, then to the list in his hand. "This," he said, "is the woman you thought you could erase." Then he lowered the page, and the sound of silence grew so thick it became a presence of its own. Julian didn't wait for permission. He walked back to the entrance and extended his hand toward her. Not in urgency, not in apology, but in reverence. His fingers brushed hers, and Celeste took them with quiet strength, her touch steady, her shoulders high. She didn't ask what had been said. She didn't need to. Everything in his expression told her what mattered. They know now. They stepped into the ballroom together. The doors that had once symbolized exclusion now opened wide, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations faltered. Glasses stilled mid-air. The music that had resumed moments before softened into near silence, not because anyone had directed it, but because the room was now listening in a different way. The Monroes walked side by side through the center of the ballroom, and suddenly the velvet carpet under their feet seemed like it had always been meant for this. Julian's face was set in calm command, but it was Celeste who turned heads, not because of her beauty, though it was impossible to ignore, but because of the poise in her step, the dignity she carried without needing to speak it. There was no dramatics in her posture, no resentment flickering in her eyes. Just the quiet radiance of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and who had no interest in shrinking to be accepted. People stepped aside as they passed. Some guests offered awkward smiles. A few gave subtle nods of apology or acknowledgement. No one dared speak. The only sound that accompanied them was the soft hush of whispering fabric, the click of her heels, and the electric hum of tension unraveling. At the center of the room, Julian paused and turned toward the stage, but he didn't ascend it. He didn't take the mic. He didn't need to. He simply turned to Celeste and placed a gentle hand at the small of her back, guiding her forward another step until she stood fully in the chandelier light. And there she stayed. Celeste didn't bow. She didn't wave. She looked out across the crowd, not demanding attention, but allowing it. Not waiting to be welcomed, but simply being. Unapologetically. Her smile was soft, graceful, measured, not triumphant. Because this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation repaid. It was about truth restored. For every person who had looked through her earlier that night, for everyone who had decided she didn't look like someone of consequence, she didn't need to explain a thing. Her presence was the correction. Her elegance, the answer. She had always belonged. She had simply chosen not to beg for it. And now they all saw her, not because she raised her voice, but because she never lowered her worth. The ballroom had long since returned to its rhythm, music swelling, glasses clinking, laughter rising in curated waves. But something beneath the surface had shifted. A current had changed direction. People still danced, still posed for photos, still smiled for the press. But they did so with the subtle awareness that they were no longer the most important thing in the room. Celeste moved through the space like a thread of silk, weaving her presence without fanfare. A nod here, a gracious smile there. No bitterness, no commentary. She greeted those who approached her with warmth, even the ones who had ignored her earlier. Some stumbled over apologies, their eyes heavy with shame. Others tried to pretend the snub hadn't happened at all. Celeste never called them out. She didn't need to. The weight of being seen, finally seen, was enough to make them squirm without her saying a word. Julian stayed close but not possessive, offering the kind of quiet support that doesn't need to be noticed to be felt. He watched her with the stillness of a man who knew exactly what he had always had, and now watched the world catch up. Just after midnight, a ripple went through the event staff. A note had arrived. No grand announcement, no camera crew, no dramatic flourish. Just a line of text on the donation ledger, handed discreetly to the foundation director by a courier in black. The director scanned the message once, then again, and looked up with wide, astonished eyes. An anonymous donation. $10 million. Designated specifically for the Celeste Monroe Equity Initiative, an arm of the foundation Celeste had created 5 years earlier to fund scholarships for Black and Indigenous girls across Europe and West Africa. The kind of work that didn't make headlines. The kind of impact that lasted longer than applause. Under her name, no one else's, no one. By morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Someone had caught the moment Julian led her through the ballroom. The photo, Celeste glowing in bronze, head held high, eyes forward, was everywhere. The woman who was erased, now center stage. Headlines spun like wildfire. Influencers reposted the clip. Commentators framed it as a takedown. Tweets racked up millions of views. Her silence was louder than their applause. Legacy over likes. But Celeste didn't check the numbers. She didn't refresh the feeds. She didn't bask in vindication. She was back in her hotel suite, feet bare, makeup washed off, her dress laid across a velvet chaise. The window was open. Paris glimmered quietly outside, unaware that it had just played host to a reckoning disguised as a gala. Julian handed her a glass of tea instead of champagne. She smiled as she took it. "You're trending," he said gently. She looked at him, then past him, out into the soft glow of the skyline. "I'm not interested in trending," she replied. "I'm interested in changing things." Because for Celeste Monroe, this had never been about reclaiming a seat at someone else's table. It was about building one of her own. If this story moved you, share it. Someone out there has stood in her shoes and needs to be reminded that grace isn't weakness and silence doesn't mean surrender. Comment below if you've ever been made to feel small and rose anyway. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak power without ever raising a voice.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.